Welcome to Unsilent with your hosts Dave and Brian. This is not another current events podcast. We're digging deeper, diagnosing, and discussing what's really going on today, how we got here, and providing observations for future generations.
Welcome to Unsilent. We're Brian and Dave. We're hoping you'll let us know where you think we got it right and where we completely missed the point, which you can do by visiting us at unsilentpodcast.com. So let's get into it. What shall we contemplate and pontificate on today, Brian?
Well, today I think we have no choice but to get into the cyclical nature of these things, kind of what people will learn as they listen. For you and I suspect this is going to be a significant part of the underlying philosophical or historical context that you and I kind of will be talking throughout is
Sure.
the cyclical nature of this. But first, I want to point something out that I think matters. And again, in the historical context for people listening 60 or 80 years from now, and for people listening today, this matters. This is not a I told you so moment. If it comes across that way, Dave, please slap me back into place. I don't want it to come across like that, but I think it's important to point this out. So as we're recording, Hamas has just, launched their thing into Israel. Like, this is the worst thing that Israel has faced since World War II, as far as like death count and things like that. So this show is not about topical events. It's about the mood and like the societal fabric, if you will. And I don't want to get too fancy with the words, but I think this matters to point out right now. One of the things you and I have talked about is how we both don't support this notion that speech should be silenced, especially speech that we don't like, because that's by definition, hate speech is anything I don't like, right?
Sure, right.
I think it's important to point out in this moment, after this attack has happened on Israel, there are a number of groups in all kinds of different geographic areas, whether it be education or other institutions, like coming out of the woodwork and like fully supporting this and saying things like, and I quote, gas the Jews in mass, like crowds of people chanting, gas the Jews, not gas the Israelis, gas the Jews. I think that's a critical distinction.
Scary.
And whether it be places like Harvard, where they have this list of groups that have come out in support of this activity, whatever. There's plenty of places where people are supporting what I would consider to be like maybe the worst possible behavior we will see from humans in my lifetime so far, right? Yeah. In a way that's like videotaped and promoted by the people doing it. That it's not like the war atrocities where people in Vietnam and other wars, of course, did horrific things, but when they were caught, they were ashamed. They were ashamed and they were punished. Like these are horrific things being promoted.
Yes.
My point is, even though I vehemently disagree with all the things those people are saying, I am grateful that they're outing themselves. Like, I still don't understand the thought of like silencing these people, because that wouldn't change their heart. It wouldn't change their perspective. It would just change how easy it is to find these people. And so I think it's important to understand that you and I are not hypocrites about this. Like, we don't say that other people should allow free speech, but we don't really mean it. You and I really do mean this. And it's never been more evident to me than now that I can't imagine saying more grotesque things than these people are saying. Yeah. And I still don't want them to shut up. I'm glad I know where they're at.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree. I mean, the problem is that if you silence that kind of speech, which I think is abhorrent, but I like you, I think I'm glad from the standpoint of them airing what they see and what they think. I'm glad they're doing that so that I know that it's there, and I know that I mean, there's as we begin to talk about the cyclical nature of humanity and the fact that with humanity there are certain underlying things that don't change, and so we have not actually moved on from the kind of abhorrent things that people said and did during the 1930s in Germany, or their supporters in the United States. I was reading an article earlier today about parallels or maybe not parallels, but about how in the 1930s there was a larger group of people in the U.S. that supported the Nazi movement before World War II than most Americans would be, happy to know about. Now, at least today, we have the internet, so we know there's people out there that are saying these things. That, I mean, the part of me that is hopeful hopes that these are just dumb college kids, stupid people saying stupid things because they really don't know what they're saying. Now, I'm sure there are a number of people that actually believe this notion, and this notion is a notion that has existed throughout history. There's always been people who have, whether overtly or covertly, wished for the painful death of their enemies. And yes, it's good that we know where they're at. It's good that we know where to avoid them.
Yeah. I don't want to like gloat and like, hey, look at how morally superior I am. I don't, but I think it's important to point out that you and I don't mean this when it's convenient. We mean this, period.
Right.
I think that's important.
And I think it is with speech. It is also important when you know it's there, then you have the ability to formulate an argument and to say in your argument, for instance, why, the position that is, no, it's bad to gas people is a morally superior position, is a morally right position compared with people that are morally abhorrent. And so, if we didn't know, if you and I blithely go along in life and think that everybody has evolved mentalities and we have, and we're just all good people now. And boy, I'm glad we've moved beyond such concepts as war and hatred and this kind of thing. We wouldn't know until it actually popped up. So thank God for the internet and the fact that we can see people doing stupid things.
Yeah, thank God for the internet. Thank God for video. Thank God for people having cameras on their phones.
Exactly.
These things have been proven to be fantastic spotlights, and I'm grateful for that.
Exactly right.
So on our topic, the cyclical nature of these things. Now, I don't think anyone could reach the age of 15 or 20 without hearing things like history repeats itself, and history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes, and like all these kinds of sayings that we grew up with that basically tell us that we have to learn these lessons over and over again, and they don't ever make sense until all of a sudden they do.
Right? Exactly.
It always seems like it's complete nonsense until one day you wake up and you go, oh, it wasn't complete nonsense.
Right.
We do in big things and small things. One of the things that got you and I talking way before we even dreamed of doing this podcast was this cyclical nature. You're much better at this than I am, of course. So just give people your understanding of the fourth turning, specifically Pendulum.
Sure.
Those are two books that you and I kind of started reading a few years ago, and just kind of the theory or the hypothesis, whatever it is behind those things.
So basically the idea, and it's not a new idea. It's actually, like anything we're talking about, it's a repeating idea. It's an idea that has existed throughout human history, and there's a lot of commentary by scholars and thinkers of old and scholars and thinkers of late. And the idea is basically that societies go through, you might even call them moods, phases, if you will. And an entire phase is essentially the 4 generations of a long human life. Now, a long human life you can, think of in terms of like the first 20 years. You've got the sort of the childhood phase, and you've got the young adult phase, 20 to 40, 40 to 60, you got middle age, and then 60 to whenever you die, 80 probably ish, life expectancy is that last phase. And throughout each of these 4 in the book that we're talking about by Strauss and Howe, The Fourth Turning, which was 1996, I think it was. And then Howe is still alive, so he's doing it. And there's been a number of books on this topic. They talk about these generations, each 20-year generation. And we typically think, when we talk in modern times about something that hasn't happened in a generation, we typically think of, 20-ish years. So if you
real quick to clarify, when you're talking about the generations in a person's 80-ish year life, 4 generations would be born in that person's 80-year life. A generation when they're 0 to 20, a different generation when they're 20 to 40, etc. So when you're talking generations, you don't mean their generations, you mean the generations that are born in that person's lifetime.
Essentially, and yes, exactly. And we think about these things in our own time as we talk about the millennial generation, we talk about the baby boomer generation, we talk about the Gen Xers, et cetera, et cetera. And when you and I have been talking about future generations, we've throughout the podcast to date, we've been talking about a future generation being somebody we call Kenny G. Now, I don't know if they'll end up adopting that terminology in the future, but who knows? Maybe we'll start something. We'll see.
Maybe we'll start something, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And to clarify, Neil, how that you're referencing one of the authors of The Fourth Turning, he coined the term millennial like that. So he's not some nutcase who you and I just like stumbled upon. Like he's a demographer, an economist, a historian. Like his bona fides are not really up for debate.
Absolutely. And he's incredibly learned. He's incredibly well spoken. I won't say that there's absolutely everything that he says that I'll subscribe to 100%, but there's nobody like that. I don't subscribe to something I said last week 100%. So there you go.
100%. Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's basically
it. Is that the generations as they're born and as they rise to power, they make decisions differently. So, for example, Gen X, the way that they were shaped as quote unquote latchkey kids, they have different priorities and different factors that they use to make decisions, and different drivers, different values. Gen Xers are, for example, just a quick example, are typically going to value independence more than a millennial. A millennial would value community more. Well, as those people age and ascend into roles where they have influence and power and like governance and things like that, they're shaped by history and they're shaped by their the nature that they're born into, the nature nurture thing. They're shaped by the circumstances they're born into, and then they shape history and how they make decisions.
Right.
And the theory is every 80-ish years, we end up with the same, they call it a constellation of these generational archetypes. There's 4 that always come in the same order. And in the societal mood shifts accordingly in very predictable and cyclical ways. So, for example, if we look at the moment we're in now, we're kind of facing the winter, so to speak, of the cycle. And if you went back 80 years from now, you would have found us right in the middle of World War II and the Great Depression. And if you went 80 years-ish before that, you would have found us right in the throes of the Civil War. If you went back 80 years-ish before that, it's the Revolutionary War. And about 90 years-ish before that, I think was Bacon's Rebellion and the Salem witch trials, where the term witch hunt was like literally coined.
Exactly.
In that it was the same moment in the cycle we're in now, which is why we are talking to Kenny G. We're trying to catch him 15 years before he finds himself in the next thing 80 years from now, which would be around the year 2100.
Right.
We're trying to warn Kenny G. It may feel like things are sunshine and unicorns right now, but we're telling you from our experience, when we thought our species and our society had evolved so much so in 2008 that things were going to be sunshine and unicorns for us, we find ourselves now in the throes of pretty nasty things that none of us would have. Well, for me, I would not have believed I would be finding myself in a situation like we're in.
Exactly. And that's really, I think, one of the benefits. You think about this, okay, well, why are these guys talking about these generations and cycles of history and all this stuff? And, it's not an academic exercise. It's really an exercise in understanding how the times can change and how you can respond to the changing times. The most important skill set that any human or any society has is the ability to predict the future. It's also very, very difficult because we typically miss the big events. I mean, in our own time, who predicted the 2008 bust in the Roaring 20s? Who predicted the Great Depression? All these things tend to come at us. But if we can understand, and the ancients in ancient times, they used to think in these sort of 4 quadrants as well. We think of these things even with spring, summer, winter, and fall and winter.
Yeah.
We think of these things as parts of nature. And really this idea, if you understand history, if we look at history this way, we can understand it with the same sort of predictability that we predict spring, summer, fall, and winter. So we don't know. It's not exactly 20 years. It could be 19 years. It could be 22 years. You know, how long is a long human life? Well, current life expectancy is a little bit more than it used to be. So maybe these 4 essential generations of time will change over time, because it's about our own living memory, right? It's about society's living memory. And society doesn't have living memory, for instance, of the Civil War. We don't have, most of us today, there's very few people today that are alive that have living memory of World War II. We read about it in books, etc. And so this gets back to that idea of people being not destined in some kind of, mythological way, but we're essentially destined to repeat these human patterns over and over and over. And, some of these books that you and I've read, one of the things that's fascinating about it is they've done fantastic jobs. I consider myself a history buff, but they've done fantastic jobs of taking this lens of these generations and what you call an entire 4 generations. They call a saeculum. It's an age, if you will, and overlaying that across thousands of years, and the remarkable consistency with which these things play out over and over and over. The wheel turns, the age-long cycle turns. It's just fascinating.
So you and I will not, people, I would recommend you read The Fourth Turning, and there's a new one that says it's called The Fourth Turning is Here, that he's released in July of this year, 2023, that okay, we're here in the midst of it. And the thing I want to stress, a couple things. One is they don't predict events.
Right.
They predict behaviors. They predict moods.
Right.
That's critical. Like you said, how long the period lasts. It might be 19 years. It might be 23. It's just like winter. How long does winter last? Well, it depends. Some winters are longer than others. Okay. Really critical that people don't say, oh, they're trying to they predicted the pandemic. No, they didn't predict the pandemic, but they did say things like a pandemic or a war or a depression or an economic collapse. These things are handled differently depending on the mood and basically who's in charge, which generation is in charge. They make decisions differently. They have different values and drivers. So I think it's important that people don't get locked on we're not trying to predict events. That's not what this is about. No. And the second thing is there's kind of the summer and winter, and then there's kind of the fall and the spring. And and in the 60s, 1960s, we had kind of a spiritual awakening. Well, that happens about every 80 years.
Mm-hmm.
We have the cataclysmic event, World War II, the Civil War, the Revolutionary War. Everybody loves each other for 20 years. And then there's a spiritual awakening.
Right.
And then that generation comes to power slowly over the next 50 or 60 years. And they're great at ideology, but they're not great at execution, maybe, or whatever.
Right.
They're just what their strengths are and what their weaknesses are played out in our society. And so there's this kind of spiritual thing that happens, and then kind of opposite of that, or a little on a different time frame, is as these institutions are built up after the cataclysmic event. Again, World War II is the last one. All these great institutions were put in place. Well, over the next 80-ish years, those institutions become corrupted and bastardized and band-aided, and they just become ineffective.
Right.
And they're so ineffective and they're so band-aided and so corrupted and dysfunctional that in many cases, they just have to be destroyed and rebuilt. And so for a person living in this moment, for me, I can't think of a single institution that doesn't feel broken, whether it's education, media, all kinds of aspects of the government, the legal system, name an institution and it just feels broken.
Right.
Where I never really felt that until, 10 years ago or 8 years ago or whatever.
Right.
And that's the part that I would not have predicted in 2008. I could have read that book that was written in 1997, The Fourth Turning, and I would have said, these guys have lost their minds. And then all of a sudden in 2017, I would have went, wait a second. I remember reading something about this, right? The other thing is I just, before we jumped on here, I did a quick search. I don't do a ton of research, but I did a quick search of the worst presidents ever ranked by whatever the pundits are. And it's interesting to note that 2 of the top 5 were the presidents immediately preceding the Civil War.
Right.
Franklin Pierce and James Buchanan. James Buchanan across the board is the worst president ever, according to everyone.
Yep.
Because he allowed the Civil War to happen. He would not act on the slavery issue. And then the second group is Warren G. Harding, no relation, by the way, and Herbert Hoover in the 1920s leading up to the Great Depression and World War II.
Right.
So these people find themselves in situations where their later history does not reflect well upon them. Warren G. Harding, when I grew up, was known as the most corrupt presidency in U.S. history. And as years have gone on, some people are now saying that maybe he didn't know that much. I don't think it's an accident to look at our current occupant of the White House.
Yeah.
And we hear at least strong theories of significant levels of corruption.
Yeah.
And then you go back to the pre-Revolutionary War days.
Yeah.
The taxation without representation, and that the corruption, like they were just taking people's money and not representing them and not addressing their needs. And this cyclical nature is just so apparent now, living in this moment in a way that was not 10 years ago for me, at least.
Well, and it's fascinating. So then that brings you to the question of, why did we get a Harding? Why did we get a Buchanan? Why did we get these various ones at these various times? And why did we get in our age Joe Biden? Why did these people come at the right time? And that is because, if you take a look at the overall generational theory, it's that society's moving in a certain direction. And because society is moving in a certain direction, a certain type of person or a certain type of institution or a certain type of thing will happen. No, we can't predict who the person is, what the specific thing that will happen is, but we can see that everything becomes ripe for this kind of thing to happen. And this is where that sort of predictive, we can't predict events, but we can predict trends and patterns and see those patterns throughout history. And that's really, when you and I were first talking about doing this podcast, we talked about, well, how can we help the future? We're probably not going to be there for it. And so what can we do about it? Well, one of the things, if we can, in this day and age, with the technology we've got right now, if we can give some hint of, here's how this stuff is actually playing out before our eyes right now in what we consider the fourth turning, then in the future, in perhaps the third turning of the next saculum, they can say, hey, it looks like we're in this very sort of selfish phase, and this could lead to this next sort of disaster crisis phase. You can see this coming, and you could perhaps mitigate some of the. I don't think you can. Human nature is, we've been dealing with the same things in human nature for thousands upon thousands of years. We're not going to mitigate human nature. But what perhaps we can do is soften the blow of some of these things that have repeated themselves over and over again.
Yeah, I think that what we would be asking of humanity on that scale is to collectively accept our own failures on a scale that's unimaginable. It just doesn't feel possible that collectively people would all say, yeah, we're a bunch of dopes. We're going to learn from people who lived 80, 160, 240 years ago. That seems like a pretty heavy lift in my opinion.
Yeah, that's a big ask.
Have that level of humility.
Right.
So a couple things I think matter for the historical context. Again, this is not going to be a podcast about the fourth turning like Neil Howe has done. He does his own podcast. He's got way more, and he has the goods. You and I are paraphrasing.
Absolutely.
That's not. These times of crisis, the crisis always comes down to one singular issue. Yes. So you and I have talked about so far in these first dozen episodes or so, we've picked a number of different things that we're kind of arguing about.
Right.
Eventually, history tells us that it'll come down to one issue. So it was the Nazi issue, in World War II. It was, are we one country or two countries in the Civil War? Right. Are we allowing slavery or not? That was a singular issue.
Right.
Are we going to be our own country or are we going to stay loyal to England? That was the singular issue in the Revolutionary War. We don't know yet what our singular issue is going to be. We get a bunch of good front runners.
Oh yeah, we've talked about a bunch of them already. Yeah,
we've talked about a bunch, and we have another 20 or so that we haven't even gotten to. So, but it always comes down to one singular issue, and it is historically been a horrific period of time. Now, I don't want to be doomsday, but we also can't be like ignorant and ignore what's being like plainly played out in front of us. Like you can see this coming. You don't have to go back very far to the 1930s in Germany and see things that very much parallel the conversation you and I had when we very first opened this thing about the attacks on Israel. Like if you can't see the parallels there, this is not the podcast for you.
For sure.
So historically, ugly things happen that are unimaginable, but we emerge.
Yes.
And we emerge rebuilt and rejuvenated. And the way I heard Neil Howe explain this the best so far is he likened it to a divorce of a very toxic marriage. And he basically says something along the lines like, when you come out of that, you'll say, it was the best thing that could have happened to me. And somebody said, would you want to do it again? You would say, absolutely not. Hell no, I don't want to do that again.
Right.
Like, it was absolutely miserable. But the alternative was so much worse. It was the best thing that could have happened.
Right.
And that has that gives it a context that I'm not excited about, but it makes sense to me. Right.
Yeah.
The alternative is we continue just mired in this world we're in where nobody can agree with anything. And we have to have a resolution, and it's going to be not very fun, but we will come out of it and we will all have shared values again. I've said numerous times throughout this podcast, I feel like this is a war of values more than tax codes and things like that. We'll get that part resolved.
Right. Well, in the way, some parallels, some analogies we might think about, you can think about it in some cases like a forest fire. A forest fire is terribly devastating, but the forest fire ultimately is good for the long-term life of the forest. Now, during the forest fire, a lot of trees die and a lot of bad things happen, but the stronger trees emerge. So that could be, another example of that. There's a quote that you've heard, that we've all heard, that sort of encapsulates these four. This force cycle, and it goes like this: hard times create strong men create good times create weak men, and weak men create hard times. So there's 100%. That cyclical thing that happens there. That's a natural progression of really, it's a natural progression of nature. So when you get into the winter time, what happens? Lots of stuff die, but the death of lots of stuff during the wintertime leads to the regenerative life in the springtime. So in a lot of ways, it's a well-designed system, because the nature, however you want to put this, does not let us get so completely dysfunctional that there's no return. At least it hasn't so far in 10,000 years of recorded history. But there's a natural reset mechanism in human nature that allows us to reset at great cost, at great, the last three turnings of I don't know if it was Howe or who it was, but there was one of the historians talked about the three republics of America. That the first republic was the Revolutionary Republic, the second republic was the post-Civil War republic, the third republic was the post-World War II republic, and now we're in the fourth republic, and that's the end that restarts, or that will restart the next republic after this one's done. And each one of those became active at the cost of millions of lives in some cases. I mean, the Civil War was the most brutally devastating war that America's ever been in. 600,000 Americans killing each other. So when you read some of these books that talk about the history of it, it seems like these resets, or these crisis generations, usually end up being something that is going to be paid for in a tremendous amount of blood, in a tremendous amount of pain. In the Fourth Turning book, one of the things that Howe talks a lot about is, will it be a new civil war, or will it be a world war? Oh my word! That's light reading, huh? And they're possible.
And I just did a quick search: 600,000 people in a population of 31.5 million.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
If you did the math on extrapolated that, it would be the equivalent of 6 million people dying today.
Yeah, exactly.
And the other thing, again, not to get like doom and gloom, I do think that there's the emergence that I hope you and I will be able to spend more time on as we work through this. But I think it's important to document what this feels like. And that's very much part of my goal with this whole podcast, and why we keep saying, tell us where we get it wrong, because we want to explain to people, as we look back on this 40 years from now, 50 years from now, 60 years from now, what this moment felt like. So you may not agree with us on our specific political ideology. Got it.
Yeah.
We don't need to argue that. What we do want to hear from you is where we're not describing the mood correctly. And there's a couple examples we'll get into here in a minute. Again, not to get all doom and gloom, but I think the thing that kind of always stands out in my mind is Abraham Lincoln did not have access to nuclear weapons.
Right.
he may have used them then, and if they were accessible, like it may have been way more than 600,000 people. We now have, as always happens, we have ever so more sophisticated and the scale in which weapons just wipe out people is like it just exponentially grows all the time. It's always going to be bigger than the last one, just by the evolution of technology. It's always going to be the biggest one yet. And that is super frightening. And part of the things that people may not have picked up on as you and I are talking, when we say things like, if guys like me and Dave are not around, because if we lose this, if it does come down to a singular issue and our side loses, like people are going to look at us and say, these were a bunch of dolts and we're glad they're gone, because the victors always get to write history.
That's right.
So part of what we're trying to do is explain, hopefully, Dave and I weren't bad guys. If our side loses, we do have good hearts and consciences, and we do have, opinions that may not be appreciated in the year 2080 by Kenny G or whatever. But hopefully people will not think that we were just like cavemen either, and like had no ability to think, besides our fire good kind of a thing,
Well, and if one of the reasons that I have hope too is because if you look at the last the three American republics, the three American turnings that we've been through, or saculums that we've been through, each one of them resulted in a slightly better world in terms of what I would call objective morality. So the first one, the lessening of power of the English monarch, and generally monarchies from there on out were, well, I mean, even before that, but they were declining in power. So a vesting of power in a single person rather than in the people itself became something that America became symbolic of. And so that advanced at great cost in terms of lives, etc. Same thing's true. We were the second of the major powers to abolish slavery. England was, to their credit, the first one with William Wilberforce in the early 1800s. So out of that, again, paid at great cost, came what we would say today, according to our morality, is better, is a more moral world out of that.
100%.
And then, of course, the third one is again the vanquishing of a dictatorial, brutal philosophy, whether it was imposed by Mussolini or Hitler or the Japanese Empire, brutal philosophies, and the prevalence of philosophies that are more towards individualism and community, etc. So in each one of these cases, the large arc of history has been what we would consider in our modern morality a positive thing. So you and I have talked various times in the past about our moods, about what we're going through, and are you optimistic, Dave? Are you pessimistic? And depends on the day you catch me, right? But
100%.
But in general, as I try to think about that objectively, and I look at the long arc of history, the momentum of history is towards a better world. Now, it doesn't happen as quickly as I would like. It doesn't happen as universally as I would like. Slavery is still practiced across the planet in lots of different places. Murderous brutality, regimes such as we're watching in the Middle East right now are still very powerful, too powerful. So these things still exist, but the broad arc of history is generally positive. So I think I'm not too concerned that Kenny G is going to be thinking poorly of us, but we'll see.
Yeah, you never know. Yeah, I think that one of the mistakes I think we all make, and when I say we all, I mean I'm including myself, is getting wrapped up in the currently it's left versus right.
Right. Yeah.
In this belief that it's always the left that's right, or it's always the right that's correct. That's not true.
Right.
And what I think we're learning is in World War II, it was, the fascists that wanted power, and it came to a head because that before that, and of course in U.S. history, it was, slavery. They wanted power. If you look at how we colonized, quote unquote, colonized the Americas, and native people were displaced, and I think the mistake that people make is believing it's left versus right, good versus evil, versus people are just looking for the angle that gives them power.
Right.
And whatever the angle du jour is, or whatever the angle of this cyclium that works is, or this cycle we're in, whatever gets us there is what people care about. I'm coming to believe it's not now I say that also having belief in Judeo-Christian values,
yes.
and personally believing that is the right path.
Yes.
And you and I talked before we started recording today. One of the reasons I wanted to do this podcast was it just struck me, and always, how could you be the person who lived 2 miles from Auschwitz during World War II and not say anything?
Right.
And as I mentioned before we started recording, I'm learning a new level of grace for those people, because in this moment, I feel like I'm smarter than the average bear. I feel like I have a good understanding of my values. I feel like I put a reasonable amount of effort into finding out what the truth is.
Mm-hmm.
And it's hard as hell to figure out what is really going on. There's an angle to everything. You can't really trust any information. And the consequences of speaking up and being wrong are life altering.
Sure.
When we talk about you get canceled, like, you cannot have an income if you say the wrong thing at the wrong time in the wrong context. And if you react to something, you could react and and feel like you're right and find out you were really led down a wrong path. And interestingly, watching people as of even today, like on Twitter and Facebook, have to say things like, holy smokes, maybe those folks were right, where 3 years ago they had changed their profile picture to match the flavor of the day and whatever. And watching some folks kind of have these epiphanies, other folks terrified to speak and just like look down and don't say anything, other folks feeling free to finally say gas the Jews, and like I'm free to finally say, like, all these things happening at once. It's this soup of just stuff happening. It's like I'm starting to like have an understanding for how you could be that person who lived 2 miles from Auschwitz and just like, take care of my family, put your head down, shut up, don't move. Hopefully people just walk by.
And you see, I think this is what's important about getting clarification and solidification to basic unchanging truths and unchanging philosophical facts and realities. And it's also what's good about understanding human nature, because the places you can go wrong, I think, that any of us can go wrong are in some of the situational details of this or that or the other thing. But when you then move back and say, and this is why I also think that a lot of what we argue about today, a lot of these details that we argue about on the daily news cycle today, are going to just kind of melt away into some, and this is, a general prediction, will melt away when a grand crisis of existential proportion comes. I think there's probably, in the Civil War era, there were probably, in fact, I know there were lots of things that they argued about that all of a sudden nobody even talked about when the Civil War itself came. And the same thing's true with, the colonists in the pre-revolutionary time were a bunch of rabble rousers. I mean, they argued about stuff, but when you had the British troops show up, that tended to clarify your values, like survive as a country. And I think that's going to happen in the future. And I also think that's where today it's easy to get so caught up in these, and this is like when you and I were first talking about the podcast. Do we really need another person to be out there talking about the latest outrage in the news today that a year from now somebody could bring up and say, oh yeah, I remember I was ticked off about that, but I can't remember exactly what it was,
I was really mad about that. I couldn't tell you what happened.
It was and that happens periodically. Somebody will bring something up, or I'll read something from the past and I'm like, yeah, that was something I was really excited about. But I don't really remember why, But then if we connect to certain principles, it's like if we take a look at not to get too much in the news cycle, but take a look at what's happening in the Middle East. There are certain things that are always 100% evil, and chopping off babies' heads, not to be too gross, but it's the news cycle.
That's what's happening.
That is 100% evil all the time. Whoever does it is performing that. So if we break it down to principles instead of, well, yeah, but they did this first to me, and therefore I'm mad, and therefore I did this to them, and so you can get in this endless thing that you're talking about, and never really get anywhere.
Yeah, and that's where I come back to, like I was just saying, I understand how people can get in the mode where they just put their head down and like look down, don't look up, don't make eye contact.
Right.
Hopefully things will pass you by. And simultaneously, I am astounded at how people don't have the balls to point out obvious evil.
Yeah, exactly.
And those things are happening simultaneously, which is part of the confusion. Not just for me, but like, where do we go? What do we do? Like you could find yourself arguing all day long about trivial things that don't matter, and you just get burned. You just get tired, and you're just like, gosh, I just don't have the energy for this. And I have to find time to like love my kids and play catch with my kid, and like, hold my grandchild and kiss my wife. And I can't be in that mood all the time. On the other hand, it seems like we neglect the things that matter and don't have the guts or grit or courage to call out the obvious things that are real atrocities. We have tons of energy to quibble about the things that aren't going to matter in 7 months.
Right. Well, and I think that also comes down to whether or not we've paid attention to what we really believe is at the core of things. It comes down to do most people have a coherent life philosophy? Like, here's what I'm willing to die for. Here, most people, most people don't spend Saturdays. They spend them. They're going to mow my lawn. I'm going to, fix up the house, whatever. You don't think, well, what am I willing to die for? It's just not the kind of thing that, we tend not to have these heavy thoughts and discussions until they stare us in the face. Do we really think about, maybe sometime we'll have a podcast about death, something that what does every person on the planet have in common right now? We're all dying, every last one of us. So, but is it something that, hey, Brian, how's it going? What are you thinking about death today? Well, no, it's, we don't have these conversations because they're hard conversations, just like we don't have hard conversations about, well, hey, there's a group in the Middle East that wants to genocide another group. What do you think about it? Well, it's not polite conversation for a party.
And frankly, I think there's two other things that are at play there. One is the NIMBYism that we've talked about. Like, if it's not in my backyard, I don't really care. And the second thing is, just reading through, the Twitter feed, and there's no shortage of people to tell us what's wrong.
Yeah.
There's a tremendous shortage of people to tell us how to fix it.
Yes, exactly.
These things are not, the solutions are not easy.
No.
If they're even apparent, and in many cases they're not apparent, and it would take a significant amount of effort, and again, humility on a scale that seems like pretty unlikely. And so we just kind of kick the can down the road until one day you can't kick the can down the road anymore because the can's on fire and it's in your living room, the curtains are on fire, and you got to act right now. And that's a very American thing to do.
Well, it is. It's the point of clarification, because to a great extent, like if you take, and I love to argue, it's fun to me. It's a party game. But when you think about, when you think about why we do these things, typically, and this is, again, I think particularly in American, we're still the colonists, we're still rabble rousers, like we have been for 250 years. There's this idea of, we just want to compete with each other. We want to compete in business. We want to compete in politics. It's like, well, I want my side to win. And if my side wins, do I have a solution now that is going to be brought forth? No, but I won. So that's really all that's important. And I think there's, I've often thought, just to take the Middle East as an example, if everybody all of a sudden got amnesia and everybody just woke up. Now, this is utopian garbage that I don't believe, but it's not going to happen. I mean, it can't happen. But would there be more of a willingness to get along with one's neighbors? Probably for a while. I mean, eventually, probably the human nature of it would all come back. Like, well, you're stepping on your dog pooped on my lawn, so now
when you said that, my first thought was yes, and what is the over under on how many months or years that could possibly
exactly.
last?
Yes, exactly. Well, and see again back to our topic for the day, but that's again because human nature works the way it works.
Yeah.
We have these cycles. We have these, strong men create good times and good times create weak men. That's just how human nature works. And I think if we can do a service for anybody in the future or today, if we can illuminate to the extent that our limited abilities allow how human nature really works, then, it seems to me that to be a successful navigator of this life, we have to know how nature works, how the world works, how the material world works. We have to know how human nature works and how these things interact with one another.
And I think that's the pragmatic side for you and I specifically, just us two individuals, that all these utopian ideas that you and I just think are just foolish, honestly, they all sound fantastic right up until you introduce human nature.
Right. They work great without humans. Yeah, they work wonderfully until humans are not involved.
They work fantastic until you say, okay, will that work with your Uncle Joe at Christmas over dinner? No. Yeah. Okay. Well, it's not going to work in a grand scale of 340 million people either.
Exactly. Well, and therein lies the problem. Well, and there's the appeal to it, because it's like we have all these problems, to each according to his need, from each according to his ability, works great until you consider that human beings are essentially greedy and selfish and lazy. So
right. It works fantastic, right? Until you say, well, would that work in your family with the 7 people you know? No.
No,
okay,
sorry.
How about your neighbors? No. How about people across, like the town next town over? No. But 340 million people, no problem.
Yeah, right. We can implement it globally, just not in a small group. Yeah.
I can't do it in my little town. But all right, Dave. Well, for those of you listening, this is going to be not a topic every time, but I think it's just important to understand, like, this is kind of a foundational concept that Dave and I believe in, that will kind of undergird many of our conversations, is this cyclical nature and things. This is the moment in time we're in. This is the season we're in more of a grand scale. And I would invite you to go check out those books. Pendulum is one. It was not written by Neil Howe and Strauss. It was written by actually marketing guys who were studying why commercials evolve over time, why marketing messaging works one way in the 80s and a completely different way in 2017, and they came to a similar but different theory. Anyhow, would really love for you guys to chime in and tell us where you think we're explaining the mood that we're in correctly, where you think we're completely missing the point. And you can do that by going to unsilentpodcast.com, or check out our videos on Rumble. There's great comments section there. You can put tons of comments in there as well. So until next time, this is Dave and Brian signing off.
See you later.
Do you want to be unsilent? Make your voice heard on our social media channels and share where you think we got it right or wrong. Go to unsilentpodcast.com for social links so you can join the discussion.